I used to go over more of the arguments. Aquinas did not like the ontological argument either. He knew of it. He liked arguments that were a posteriori, that is, the arguments that were not totally abstract, but depended on some observations about the real world. Now, Aquinas' 5 ways, which are included in a big book on theology, and I mean, for Christian theologians, and I imagine it goes the same, for conservative Jewish theologians, and I guess in the case of Islam as well. They're not going to take these arguments as what their central faith is based on. They more or less look at these arguments as kind of icing on the cake, probably, and even the Apostle Paul said he knew that some of these subtle arguments were around. He was a very learned man. Aristotle had these arguments out, 300 years before Christianity. The Apostle Paul said, look, I'd rather your faith be based on the ability of God to raise a man from the dead. That is, the central doctrine of Christianity, the resurrection, than some subtle philosophical argument. The Apostle Paul says that in one of the epistles. I think it's in Corinthians. But at any rate, but theologians do consider these arguments, and so these 5 ways are really put in a huge book that he has, the Summa Theologica, and we're only gonna look at the design argument. So the first 3 ways are versions of and basically a Christian adaptation of the cosmological argument, the argument from a first cause, the argument that says the cosmos, hence the word cosmological, needed a designer. The first 3 ways are different versions of the cosmological argument using different concepts of causation. The 4th argument we're not going to worry about at all, but the 5th way of Aquinas is a very simple version of the design argument. Now your author on page 63, and I haven't been using this, and somehow I took my reading glasses out of it and didn't put them back in. I have a number of pairs of them, but none of them with me, but that's all right. Your authors note that the design argument was called by Immanuel Kant the teleological argument. Telos means a purpose. I think I've got this somewhere in the slides. So the teleological argument then centers on the idea that things in nature seem to have their own purposes. And this is very much in line with the Judeo-Christian view that if God designed the world, he designed things in the world to fulfill certain functions or purposes. But this was also a view that Aristotle had about things in nature. In other words, Aristotle talks about inanimate things like a knife having a function or purpose, a telos, and he also talks about, and we saw this in his Ethics, he argues whether we as human beings have an essential nature or a specific function or purpose that defines who and what we are, right? And we saw that for Aristotle, it's that we're reasoning beings. He thinks that it's our rationality, our ability to follow reasoning, in a way that non-human animals can't. That sets us apart in the whole order of living things. And so Aristotle believes that there are things in nature that have purposes or causes. He calls these final causes. The purpose of a thing, for what was the thing made, that to him is the final cause of something. It's different from what we call efficient causes. In other words, if well, never mind. I'm not going to go down that road too long, but the point is, Aristotle has a view of nature where things are imbued with purposes, and so do people in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Now, naturalists, people who think that there's only this world, after Newton and specifically after Darwin, you come out with a view of the world that essentially takes the purposes out of the world. For Darwin, evolutionary development was, by adaptation and natural selection, which was governed not by any purpose at which the whole thing aimed, but by chance. In other words, on the traditional Darwinian view, you and I are here as a happy, serendipitous accident of nature. As a 20th century evolutionist put it, if we ran the whole thing over again from scratch, there's no guarantee that it would create us or anything like us, the evolutionary process. Whereas for Aristotle and for the traditional Judeo-Christian framework of things, there are purposes in nature. And so the design argument focuses on this, hence the name teleological argument. That is, that things seem to serve a purpose. And we'll see this in a moment, that Paley really focuses on that. So the fifth way of Aquinas, in case you haven't figured it out, the 5 ways are 5 different ways to prove God's existence just from observations in nature. This is sometimes called natural theology. The idea is, can we glean anything about the maker of the universe from the universe itself, from nature itself? You know, can we glean anything about the existence and character of the author of nature, about God? So, what he says is things in nature that don't have intelligence themselves, that lack what he says understanding, that lack a mind, nonetheless act towards some function or goal. But he says if they lack an internal intelligence, then they cannot direct themselves toward that goal on their own. And if you think about it, even a smart bomb, you know, or a guided missile, you say, well, that can direct itself toward the target on its own. Yeah, because it was programmed by a human intelligence. I mean, so Aquinas uses what I don't think is the best illustration, but who am I to judge Aquinas? He literally talks about an archer, and he says, look, you know, an arrow is not going to direct itself to the goal, to the target, by itself, right? It has to be directed to that target by an intelligent archer, an intelligence, right? You know, if that's the goal. And so he says that there are things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose. You know, and here we get this view of nature imbued with purposes, not just governed by blind chance and mechanical forces. Likewise, he says, things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose cannot direct themselves to have this purpose on their own. They need to be directed by an external intelligence, by an intelligent designer. And, you know, obviously for him, this designer is God. Now, we're going to see when Hume comes to criticize this argument, one of the ways he argues against it is from the same observations, we can get more than one possible conclusion. Now, for a theologian like Aquinas, though, there's only one God around. It's interesting, in the Old Testament, there's a Greek, of course the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, and there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament called the Septuagint, from the word seven. It was supposedly translated by 7 scholars. And the word that the ancient Israelites used to refer to the people in other nations and their religious structure was the word atheoi. You say, boy, that sounds a lot like atheists. Why did they call them atheists when they had all kinds of gods, right? In Mesopotamia and Egypt, you see these gods with crocodiles' heads and stuff. Well, of course, the ancient Hebrews called the people in these culture atheoi because they thought, well, the gods they worship don't really exist. They're not gods at all. There's only one God that's around, and that's the God of monotheism. And so for somebody like Aquinas, there's only one possible option here. that if the world was designed, it was designed by the same God that he encounters in the Bible and church tradition. Now, what Hume tries to say is if we just look at the argument itself, though, more than one conclusion is possible. So, at any rate, now, among other things, Hume says we're supposed to conclude the existence of a perfect and supremely intelligent designer. One of Hume's points is that from an imperfect world, you're not necessarily entitled logically to conclude that if there was a designer of an imperfect world, that the designer must be perfect, must have all the traditional attributes of God. And actually, that is one thing. Aristotle's concept of God was not of a personal God that was intimately involved in the everyday lives of believers. Aristotle had this concept of God as what he called the prime mover. In other words, a sort of distant God that was intimately involved with the contemplation of his own perfect nature, but that basically was the source of the world, but very standoffish. And so from the design argument, you don't necessarily get all of the traditional attributes of God that we saw in the ontological argument, which is one interesting fact about the ontological argument. In other words, if you say that you can get that the universe was designed by a powerful intelligence, well, you don't get other things from that. So, at any rate, but we're going to look. I made visible to you today because it's actually listed for the class after this class in the syllabus, Hume's criticisms of the design argument. But we want to kind of look at it. Like I said, I forgot I always assume, which I shouldn't, that there's a pair of reading glasses in my in the briefcases I carry, but somehow I took them out, used them, didn't put them back. So you got to put things back where they belong. But in your book, it discusses the design argument, and I think there's some justification for considering especially this argument, because that's the one that seems to be getting so much play in the whole debate over whether intelligent design ought to be taught as a competing scientifically viable theory to evolution in the school system, right? I mean, that's a debate that's going on. Evidently, Pennsylvania made, last year or the year before, I saw an article on that where there was a big discussion on that. If you were here for the video, you saw a clip that's pretty much the selection in your book from Paley. And I think Paley has a better example of contrivance or design than the one Aquinas uses of the archer. Paley talks about walking across a field, a heath, right? Here we walk across the field. If we're in Scotland, we walk across the heath. and he finds the rock. And what does he say about the rock that he? Right. It's like, okay, nothing special about the rock. Might have been there forever. But he walks along a little further, and what else does he find in the heath? A watch, right? Now, does he draw the same conclusion about the watch that he did about the rock? Oh, well, was here. The rock was formed by forces of nature, nothing special. Here the forces of nature have come together to form a watch. That's not what he says, right? But the question is, and here's where we get telos coming into play. Why was his answer different about the watch? What does he say was different about the watch that he didn't really find in the stone? Uh-huh.
Wasn't it like he thought that someone else would put it there because you can easily, like, a rock kind of comes from nature, but it kind of takes time for somebody to make a rock just like
Okay. He thinks it had to have been made by intelligent hands. And what fact about the watch brings us to this conclusion that must have had an intelligent designer?
The moving pieces was framed.
Pardon?
The moving pieces was framed.
Very good. Yeah, you're saying that's exactly his point. That the mechanism, the pieces inside the watch, aren't just thrown there willy-nilly, but they work together to accomplish a purpose, right? Just like, these things that we are all walking around with nowadays. Nowadays we'd say, and if I found in crossing a heath, if I found a smartphone on the ground, I would hardly come to the same conclusion that I did about the rock, right? So, in other words, the bottom line here, and here's where we get the telos, the purpose. He says, look, the parts of the watch were coordinated together to form a purpose. The watch serves a purpose. Now, and that's what he says at the very bottom of 63, the top of him. He says, I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given about the watch, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. And he says, yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not an admissible one in the second case as in the first? And he says, for this reason and for no other, namely that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that, as he said, the several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, e.g. that they are formed and adjusted to produce motion. And he goes into this big spiel. See, part of what you need to understand when you read stuff is to look at what is the bottom line? What's the conclusion? Now, what follows this is something that we're not going to read. He goes into the intricate workings of a watch in much more detail than you and I need to worry about. But that's not the most important thing here. But he's saying that, the important thing is that all of this machination, moves the hands in a way that enables us to use this implement to tell time, right? In other words, all of these gears work together to enable the watch to serve the purpose of enabling us to use it as an instrument for telling time. Now, the ontological argument we saw was a direct, basically what logicians call a deductive proof. It was trying to show with absolute mathematical certainty that God must exist, right? In other words, to buy the premises, the definitions of God in the argument, and deny the existence of God in both cases was Anselm's case and Descartes' case was supposed to lead you into a direct contradiction. That's the deductive arguments are the strongest possible arguments. They say, look, if you buy the reasons given in support of the conclusion, what are called the premises, it would be a direct contradiction for you to accept as true the premises and deny the conclusion. You know, that's as strong as you can get. But probabilistic arguments are not that way. There are a number of different types of probabilistic arguments. One of the types of probable arguments is an argument from analogy. That is basically where you're saying, look, A and B are alike in respects 1, 2, and 3. Therefore, probably they are alike in respect 4. And so a probable argument doesn't establish its conclusion with absolute ironclad certainty, but it says, hey, look, given the facts and the premises, the conclusion is highly probable. So what is the analogy here? Well, now here for Paley, the analogy is between a man-made item like a watch and something we would find in nature. Now, the conclusion is stated kind of on 66. Now we're jumping over some of it because we're going to come back to it maybe after we look at Hume. What he says, the application of the argument, every indication of contrivance is another word for design, of deliberate design. Every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater and more than the degree which exceeds all computation. In other words, now remember, if you don't have the book yet, and hopefully most of you do, but not everybody does, if we look at our website, Blackboard, you will see in supplementary readings a selection from Paley, which is pretty much what is in your, oh, okay, I already had it there. No, don't. All right. Which is pretty much the selection that's in your book. Man, I thought. Okay. Except, see, I like my choice of readings even better than your authors, because what I do, and I did this for a class where we weren't using a book, and I was giving them some readings, but you know, as I said, see, there's the reading of The Myth of the Cave, Letter from Birmingham Jail, the Credo, which we discussed, a selection from Paley's Natural Theology, and there's the writing guide that we went over. Now, what you see here is pretty much, and I don't know why it's doing all this. It's a longer selection, but here is where he talks very specifically about one of the works of nature. And when you see philosophy books, one of the things that you rarely see are any kinds of illustrations or pictures. But it's very different. I once had a used copy from the early 1800s of Paley's Natural Theology that I bought at a used bookstore. And if you actually look through it, there are lots of pen and ink drawings of organs like the eye in back of us, and other parts of the human body, and also things in animals. And he essentially repeats the same point over and over again. In other words, he'll say, well, look at how intricate this organ is, or look at how intricate this is, and this isn't this evidence of contrivance or design? And this is one of the things that Paley says later on in his book. He says, were there no example in the world of contrivance, of design, except that of the eye, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. So this is so basically, there's the argument from analogy, right? He says, well, look, compare a work of human design like a watch to something like the eye. Okay, the watch has intricate parts that work together to enable it to fulfill a particular function, in this case, moving the hands in a precise way that enables us to tell time. And then he would say, well, look at something like the eye. Doesn't it have the same kinds of features of having a lot of different parts, you know, the iris and the pupil and da-da-da-da-da-da, that all seem to work and function together to enable that organ in our body to use it for us to see with, right? To fulfill that purpose or function. Okay, so there are the premises, right? A is like B in these respects, right? They both have intricate parts that work together to fulfill a function. And then Paley would say, but the watch needed a designer to get all those wheels and gears moving together in the right way. And we know that it was a human designer in this case, but he's saying, well, look at this particular work of nature, the human eye. If it's like the watch in having intricate parts that work together to fulfill a purpose, and the watch needed a designer, well, shouldn't the eye that shows evidence that it has intricate parts that work together to fulfill a telos or purpose, shouldn't the eye have needed a designer as well? And of course, Paley would go on, what else or who else would the designer of the eye be than God himself? You know. So there's the design argument, right, in a nutshell. And, yeah, you know, I think Hume's right in calling it an argument from analogy. Now, again, arguments from analogy are not absolute airtight arguments, but they say if A and B are alike in certain respects, then probably they're alike in other respects. So you're saying if the watch is like the eye in a lot of respects, having parts that work together to fulfill a purpose, why wouldn't the watch also be like the eye? Or why wouldn't the eye be like the watch in needing a designer as the watch needed a designer? You know. In other words, you're saying, okay, if the eye is like the watch in these respects, then probably it's like the watch in the other respect of needing a designer. Now of course, you know, there are counter arguments to this. One of the things that Paley does that we're going to look at after we look at Hume is try to anticipate some criticisms. And that's what some of the stuff we skipped over comes to, but they'll make more sense if we look at Hume, because Paley wrote after Hume, and for the longest time I wasn't sure whether he really read Hume or not, but I was convinced. I've been convinced by something I've read recently that yes, Paley read Hume. He knew of Hume's argument. Look at the first parts of the PowerPoint on Hume on the design argument. So when we were looking at philosophic writing, we said one good thing to do is anticipate criticisms. But at the beginning of that PowerPoint, you will see Hume doing another thing that we said is a very good thing to do. Before Hume criticizes the argument from design, he summarizes it. So at the beginning, it looks like Hume is giving the argument from design, but what he's doing is he's summarizing it. So we'll look at that next time and see if you can follow it. Philo is David Hume in the dialogues. Cleanthes is like a very sophisticated, intelligent believer who puts a lot of stock in these naturalistic arguments. Damia is more or less your ordinary person on the street, your sort of fundamentalist believer. You know, those are the three characters in the dialogue. So anyway, look at that. My PowerPoint covers more than the small selection from Hume that immediately follows the design, Paley, in your book. But we'll look at that next time at Hume's critique of the design argument and his summary. But at any rate, that's what the design argument is in a nutshell. Thank you very much. Track down the roll if you didn't sign it. Sign it on the way out. See you all on Friday. Take care.